The centrifugal forces in today's world are simply too powerful for us to work out our own salvation, for us to be able to rely on our own devices. If we really wish to live our lives focused on God, but don't wish to retire from the world to live in a monastery or an equivalent, we have to have a pattern of guidance to follow. So Islam has instituted this thing called the Sunnah, which, as you'll remember from Dr. Jackson's lecture yesterday, means the normative practice, the blueprint for life exemplified by the Prophet. Sunnah is a word which means a norm or a wont. Slightly old-fashioned word, but it's the one that comes closest to it, I think. It denotes, as I said, the norm of practice exampled by the Prophet and also by his companions. And rather, as medieval Christians often sought to improve themselves by modelling themselves after Christ, the famous principle of imitatio Christi, so also devout Muslims have consciously sought to sculpt not just their souls, but also their outward pattern of behaviour on the model laid down by the Prophet. Now, this thing called the Sunnah includes the 5 pillars, but as I've said, it's not limited to it. They are its backbone. They are the basic warp and woof of the Muslim life, if you like. But Islam does go much further, and the Sunnah provides a complete blueprint for the significant aspects of human life. For instance, there's even a Sunnah on how to clean your teeth. This kind of thing often seems strange to people nurtured on Western ideas of religion, which say that there's a secular and a sacred realm, and the sacred doesn't necessarily have much to say on the little mechanics of life. But we know that the Prophet used a particular type of toothbrush that was made from the arak wood, which has some herbal and antibiotic properties. And very many Muslims nowadays will insist on using a toothbrush made of the same kind of wood, and cleaning their teeth when the Prophet cleaned his teeth, which was after every meal and before every prayer. One of the sights that seems strangest to Western visitors to mosques often is the sight of men and women quickly scrubbing their teeth before they start to pray. But the Sunnah, obviously, given the diversity and unpredictability of human life, cannot always take the form of specific rules. Very often, the Prophet simply issued general patterns, general paradigms of guidance. For instance, there's no immensely detailed body of hadiths on how to bring up children. Instead, we have global guidance in hadiths which say, for instance, that there are general moral principles. Famous hadith often cited is that a rough Bedouin from the desert once came to the mosque and saw the Prophet allowing his grandchildren to play on him, to climb on him when he was praying, and when he'd finished, he kissed them, and the Bedouin thought this was ridiculous, and he said, "You kiss your children? We never do that in our tribe." And the Prophet just looked at him sadly and said, "Man la yarham la yurham," which means whoever shows no love and compassion can be shown no love and compassion by God. So that's a general injunction, and the actual nitty-gritty of how you would extend that to your children is left to individual circumstances. Similarly, there are hadith which commend showing compassion and love to the elderly. I noticed that Syria's first old people's home opened only last year and was regarded not as some wonderful sign of progress, but as a very lamentable indication of the moral state of the Syrian nation, that there were some old people who simply weren't being looked after by their families any longer. I've seen this in my wife's family, because my father-in-law has Alzheimer's disease quite badly, and in most English families he would have been hospitalized long ago because he simply cannot care for himself in any way. He can't get out of bed and so forth. But the extended family has risen to the occasion and regards it as a point of honor that the head of the family should be looked after, taken to the bathroom and so forth, fed for the rest of his days. And institutionalizing him would be regarded as very shameful. But again, detailed rulings on that can't exist. It's a general principle that's been laid down by the Sunnah. Very often also the Sunnah takes the form of prayers. I mentioned this thing called the Salat, conventionally translated as prayer, but really no less importantly for the spiritual economy of the Muslim life are the optional, more informal prayers known as dua in Arabic. Again, one of these not quite pronounceable words. Dua means prayer more in the Western sense, i.e. a petitional, improvised prayer for your own circumstances, for your family's health, etc. The usual things people pray for. Sometimes people will make up their own prayers to suit the moment. Very often they will use prayers that have been handed down from the Prophet or from his companions or from some of the great saints of the past. And I've included, I think, 3 or 4 of them in the handout, just so you can get a brief insight into the kind of prayers that the Prophet gave us. There are some prayers which one can say at specific occasions, and again it's part of Islam's concern to sanctify every aspect of human life, that there are often prayers from the Prophet for even quite trivial things. For instance, if you drink a glass of milk, the Prophet, we know, said, "O Lord, bless us in this and grant us an increase in it," as you drink a glass of milk. And so you'll see pious Muslims whispering this as they raise a glass of milk to their lips. Now, there are prayers for all kinds of circumstances. There are even prayers to be said while having sex, for instance. So the Sunnah is often stereotyped as some kind of formalistic grid that reins people in, that imposes a straitjacket which cramps the human life. But in fact, large areas of human life are subject only to general, global injunctions and are not laid down in detail. It is overwhelmingly a voluntary mechanism. The 5 pillars are obligations. Most of these other things are simply optional. And optional in the formal axiology of Islamic law means something that you are rewarded for doing, not punished for not doing. And Islam assumes that there's a right and a wrong way of doing everything, rather in the way that, say, traditional lifestyles in the Far East have tried to formalize and turn everything into something beautiful, even fairly profane things like the famous Zayn tea ceremony in Japan is an example of how a fairly profane, ordinary action can be turned into something that's even quite beautiful and artistic. And Islam tries to do this, to celebrate the potential nobility of human life. So Islam assumes there's a right and wrong way to do everything. And to consciously choose the right way, as explained by the Prophet, reminds us of God. That's why we do it. It's a reminding which is cemented and often represented by one of these short prayers. So that's this thing called the Sunnah.